Okay, so I guess we'll just get started over here. Looks like we got some people that are still showing up, but we can get started here for now. All right, well, welcome and thank you for being here. This is the 402 webinar on dynamic data sources. My name is Raul, and I am a support specialist and professional services ninja here at Klipfolio. I also run some of the other webinars at the 400 level, and you might have seen some of those as well. I've been with Klipfolio for a little under a year, and you might have also seen me respond to your chats, tickets, and phone calls, and that's what I do. So welcome once again, and I'm very excited to have you here today. Now, I just want to mention before we move forward that we do have a worksheet that you can refer to, and you can fill in the blanks as we go along. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share that worksheet in the chat here. And if you click on that, you should see this. And you'll see that you can fill in the blanks as we go along here. And I also have some useful resources that I would be referring to as we go through the webinar. All right, so feel free to fill that worksheet out as you go along. I'm just going to drop some background information and maybe some tips as well, so you'll have access to that later on to refer to. Now, the idea of these webinars is to address the most common subject matters that we see in our support queue and the most common questions that we get on them as well. And one of the most popular areas that people reach out about is on dynamic data sources, hence the 402 webinar. Now, these come in the form of a few flavors. So what we will do is we'll go through some of them, and you will see as we go through the various use cases, how people are using dynamic data sources. Okay, so we will do that, and then we'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so feel free to stick around for that. And if you have any questions that you have thought of, you can just get that answered then. So let's get started. Now, the first use case here is moving dates. Typically, you want your data source to automatically update based on a specific date range. So instead of relying on a static date range of, let's say, February 1st to the February 15th, which is today, you want the dates to be updated automatically so that your data is always showing what is most current. So maybe the first of the month to today. Otherwise, this is also known as months to date. So let's look at an example. The first example that I have is this. So this is a static data source. And this is a static data source because if we look at our query, we have hard-coded the start and end dates for this data source. So let's give it a second here. Okay, so if you look at this here, you will see that we have a start date of the 1st of February 2017 and an end date of 2017 February 15th, which is today. So, of course, this is okay, but the trouble with this data source is that it's only ever going to return data for that set date range, right? It's not too useful. So what would be more useful is if it automatically got data from the start of the month to today, so your end date is always a moving date and not a static one. So this is where the Klipfolio date parameters come in handy. So I'm going to show you a different version of this same query that is using dynamic date functions. And what I will do is I'll show you what are some of the ones that are available and then go through some examples. So if you look at this data source, you'll see that the start and end dates look a little bit different. Okay, so the start date has got this squiggly bracket and then the date start of month, and then the end date has got this squiggly brackets and then date dot today. So what are these? These are basically Klipfolio date parameters, And we are using those to set the start and end dates instead of using hard-coded values. So if you refer to the worksheet and document that I just shared earlier with you, in the second sheet there are useful links. And one of them at the top is documentation on Klipfolio date parameters. Okay, so I'm just going to pull that up here. So these are the Klipfolio date parameters, and you can use them within your data source. So you'll see here we have the start of month, which we are using in our data source, and it sets the date or time to the start of the current month. Okay, and the other one that we're using is today. So if we look at it here, it sets the date time to the current date time in EST. Okay, so that's what we're using here. What we're saying is that we want the start date to be the start of the month and the end date to be today. And this is always going to be updated dynamically because this is a Klipfolio data or date parameter. So how do we know for sure that these are the dates that are being pulled in? What is really cool is this little tool that we have that you can use. Okay, so if you look at this query, what we can do is we can use this HTTP bin tool that we have provided for you. Again, this is in your worksheet, sheet number 2, as a resource. If you look at this data source, what we have is appended httpbin.org /get ? Okay, and then we put the same query here and paste it after the question mark. So when you resolve this, or when you click on Get Resource to evaluate that, this is going to return what we are seeing in the query. So this is our query. This is URL encoder, so it looks a little bit different, but that's what's getting passed to Google Analytics to get data. The thing that we're interested in is the start date and the end date. So you'll see that our date functions have successfully been converted to the start date and the end date of the 1st of February and the 15th of February. So that looks pretty good. And also note, we mentioned that this is dynamic, so as the days go on, so if it goes to tomorrow or the day after, date.today will automatically update to the 17th, to the 16th. So your data is always going to be current from the 1st of the month to the current date. Okay. There are a few other useful things that I want to highlight here. The other thing that we want to highlight is dot format. So you can set dot format to get a particular format for the time. This is important because different services may require different date formats. Sometimes you may want the format to be day, month, year, as opposed to our default. Sometimes the service might want it in epoch time, which is the number of seconds that has transpired since 1970, January 1st, I believe. Okay, so if you do dot format, and then you put in, let's see, an example, day, month, year, and you do get resource, still using our HTTP bin tool, you'll see what it comes through as. So you'll see that by default, it's 2017-02-15 with dashes, but since we have specified a format, it's coming in as date, month, and the year. So that's how you can use the format. And the other thing that you can also do is some people like to get data in a rolling time frame. So they always want to get certain time frame, like the last 7 days or the last 30 days. So you can use functions like this, the last 7 days, and put that in there instead of the start of month. So we can just delete that and say date last 7 days. And if we evaluate that, the date that's being passed is the 8th of February to the 15th. So that gives us that 7-day period. Okay, so those are some of the things that you can do with the date parameter. So I highly recommend you to open that up and then play around with it. One very important thing to note is that here I have created a data source that has got dynamic data sources or dynamic dates in there. If I were to create it from a static data source, so initially I had the hard-coded value and I changed it to a dynamic data source, it would not work. So anytime you create a new data source that is dynamic, you want to make sure that you build it from scratch. It has to be brand new. So that is one thing that you need to note on your worksheet. I believe that's point number 2. Okay, when creating a dynamic data source, you need to create a new data source from scratch, as editing the existing static one will not work. So once you have done that, you can always bring that data in and you create that new data source that's dynamic now. You just create a new, you bring it into your clip and then repoint to those data columns or the data points, and you should be set. Okay, so that basically wraps up that portion on using dynamic dates within your query to make it a dynamic data source. So the next use case here is using a drop-down control to run the dynamic data source. So you might need to get the same data for different IDs, for example, and in the context of Google Analytics, perhaps the same data for different profile. You might want to get the same number of clicks or the same number of the same metrics, but you want to be able to get that for different profile IDs and not have to create 10 different data sources for 10 different profile IDs. So what you can do is you can have drop-down user input control that allows you to select the user profile ID and get data for that specific profile ID. So of course, I have an example to show you, and our documentation covers the Google Analytics example that I just mentioned. So I'll just show you the documentation here. So do dynamic data sources. That covers the whole use case I just mentioned about GA profile ID. So you can go through that yourself. Again, this is a resource that's in worksheet number 2 that you can refer to. What I am going to use is I'm going to use a different service just to give you a more, I guess, more exposure to different services. The service that I am going to use is Asana. So I'm just going to look that up here. There you go. Okay, so this is Asana. And Asana is a CRM, and they allow you to pull in tasks from projects. And so that's what I'm going to use for my example here. So this is the static data source. If I reconfigure the data source, you'll see that this is my query, and I am manually putting in the project ID, and it gets me the tasks for that specific project ID. Now, I could have more than one project ID, but I want to get the same data. I want to get the tasks for all the project IDs that I have and be able to toggle between the different project IDs. So how can I do that? That's when the dynamic data source comes in handy. So I've already created a clip. Let's see here, where is it? Asana tasks. Add to dashboard. So this is the clip that I created using that one data source there, and it's using my static data source, and it's only ever going to give me the task details for that one ID that I used. So that's kind of useless. I want to be able to toggle between the different project IDs. So how can I do that? So here is, again, where we create our dynamic data source. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a dynamic version of this same data source, and then feed it into this clip, so that this clip is going to populate the table based on the project ID that we are selecting in our user drop-down control. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a variable that is going to hold our project ID. So the first thing we want to do is create that. You can do that in the editor itself. You can create a new variable. The other way you can do it is, since we need a user input control, this would make more sense to go this route, and just the workflow might make a little bit more be a little bit more clearer. So the first thing we want to do is we want to be able to select the project ID. So we're going to create a user drop-down control, and I already have a data source here that has got all my project IDs and the names. So I'm just going to reference that directly. My values are going to be the IDs, and the names are going to be my labels. Okay, this is something that we covered in our other webinars, so I'm not going to go into too much details, but it's basically just referencing values into this drop-down user input control. And this is where we create our new variable. So here we want to create a variable called project ID, and we want to be able to provide a sample project ID so that we can actually generate that data source. So it will act as a default value. Now I've already done that, so you can see that if I go to manage variable, I already have a project ID here, and that's my default value. So I'm just going to use that. Okay. So now we have that. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to create a new Asana dynamic data source, right? So we've already got this, but we want to be able to pass that into a dynamic data source so that that data source can update for us. So what we can do is we can look at our existing static data source and then copy and paste this similar setup. So obviously we don't want to duplicate it. We want to create it from scratch, as I mentioned earlier. So let's go to library, data sources, and create a new data source. And we're going to look up Asana. And we do have a connector for that. So we're going to create a custom data source. So here is where you would have specified the project ID. Instead of specifying it by hard coding it, we are going to be bringing in a user variable to do that. Okay. So to reference a variable here, the most important thing that you need to know is that you need the squiggly bracket, you need the props, and then we're going to put in project ID, which is our variable. So this is something that you need to note, and you can fill this up in your worksheet as well. Whenever you bring in a variable, this is the standard convention: squiggly brackets, props, dot, and then the project ID. And that's going to bring in the variable value that we set in the user input control. So that takes care of that, and I'm just going to copy our authentication from our other data source. And this is basically it. So let's just do get data. And there you have it. We have this data here, so we can just go continue, Asana, tasks, dynamic. That's not what I wanted, dynamic 2. So this is our dynamic data source. So we're going to bring that in. Okay, so dynamic 2, that's the one that we're using right now. So let's create a new table, but this time around, this table is going to be referencing the dynamic data source and not the static one. Okay, so let's just delete those. This is the name of that, and that's the ID of that task. So let's save and exit. Okay, so you can see that if we toggle between the different project IDs, we get the different tasks that are associated with them. Some of these don't have tasks, so we have blanks. But those that do, we do get those tasks IDs and the task names. Okay, so notice this stays static, this is dynamic. So right there is that value proposition why you would want to use a dynamic data source to build your clip to get that same data but across different project IDs. Okay, so one thing to note here, you might have seen some minor initial loading. Based on the amount of data that you're that you are returning from the service, it might take a little bit longer than a regular static data source to refresh, but after that initial load, it should be pretty quick. Also, one thing to note is we do not recommend using this method, creating dynamic data sources, if you are going to be creating across 100 or over 150 profile IDs. Generally, we say keep it 10 or less to make sure that the efficiency is there. The other thing is some people like to use this method to put in the start and end dates that you saw previously in the Google Analytics data source. That's something that we don't recommend because you can have many types of combinations of start and end dates, and that's going to create a lot of different instances. And that is basically going to impact your performance. So instead, what you want to do is just get a larger set of data and then filter that within the data source instead of filtering it within the query. So I just mentioned instances. What they are basically versions of the same data set, but for each variable. Okay, so you'll see here that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 project IDs because we're using project ID, and each of it has got its own data set. If you click on data, it's going to show you the data. So this is one project ID that didn't have tasks, but if you looked at other ones, they would have had them. So that is a cool way to segue into, I guess, the next portion, which is on debugging dynamic data sources. So dynamic data sources are pretty amazing, as you can see, and you can imagine why they are popular, but there may be times when you need to debug or troubleshoot the data source because you're not seeing the data that you're expecting on your clip. If you have a clip that uses a dynamic data source and it's not displaying the expected data, the first question, of course, is to ask if you created the dynamic data source from scratch. If no, try that first. Always create a dynamic data source from scratch. Otherwise, if you did create it from scratch, you can investigate the dynamic data source using the About This Data Source option. So either you can go to About This Data Source, or you can open that data source up using Library, and then go into the data source, and then opening it up, and that brings you to the same page, About This Data Source page. Okay, so what you want to do is basically replace view with Debug Info. Debug, it's supposed to be underscore, shows up as a dash. Okay, and that basically gives you this view, and what this view shows you, as I mentioned earlier, are the different instances for each combination of the data set. So based on the project IDs, I have 5 project IDs, I have 5 instances. So sometimes what you might see though is you might see things like these. You might see that the property is empty, okay, or you might see that the last refresh date is empty. So sometimes you might see no value in the last refresh dates. What those mean is that that instance is corrupted. It did not populate data properly. In that case, you can just click on the X and delete them. So, for example, this one has got no last refresh dates. I can just click on X to delete that, and that will delete that instance for me. And the next time I run my query in the in the clip, it's going to create that instance for me again, so that I'll always have that data. So let me just share that documentation again with you. It's also available as a link in your sheet number 2. And again, the information on the worksheet is available here. You're basically replacing view with the debug info, so that goes there in your worksheet. The last tip that I want to share here is if you have a lot of data source instances, and instead of deleting one at a time, you can delete a whole bunch of them at the same time. And you can do that by doing $delete all equals to 1, and that will clear all your data source instances for you. Okay, so that's one quick tip that I want to share with you. And once you do that, you want to change debug info back into view, and then you can reconfigure your data source to get your data again. And then now, when you run that clip, it's going to dynamically create those instances for you again. So that brings me to the end of this portion on debugging dynamic data sources. And basically, this is the end of the webinar as well. As you saw, it's pretty useful what you can do with dynamic data sources. You can use it for moving moving dates, or you can use it to get different information for different profile IDs. Now, the third one there is pagination, so you can fill that up in your worksheet as well. The third common use case is pagination, and I have an example in the worksheet page 2 that refers to using the Folio pagination. If you actually go to support.klipfolio.com, let's see. You can do pagination. And you'll see some of the examples that we have for Pipedrive, and then Podio, Zendesk. What pagination is basically for you to traverse through multiple pages of data. Some services restrict you to returning a certain number of records on one page. So if you want to traverse through multiple pages and get multiple pages of data in, you would use pagination, and dynamic data sources are useful for that. So that's the third one, and you can refer to the documents on the community post here to get some ideas on how you can do that. It differs from service to service, so it's something that you could look into on your own time. And if you need help, feel free to reach out. You'll see that we have the contact information available in the worksheet sheet number 2 as well. You can reach out anytime to support@klipfolio.com, and we'll be able to help you out. And also, I urge you to sign up for the other webinars that we have available. They're very useful to help you out. So please do that. I have the link to the website there. The last thing is the community. As you can see, these are actually posted on the community, and the community is a great resource for you to get information. I urge you to participate in there. If you have questions, You can ask them there, and someone can pick that up there. Or if you do something cool, I would urge you to post it here as well and share it with the community so that everyone gets benefit from that cool thing that you did. So that's basically the end of the webinar. I appreciate you being here, and hope to see you at our other webinars that are coming up. Take care and have a good one. Bye now.